So welcome to this conversation with me. I'm Henry Faber. I'm one of the founders at Opperton Education, for those who don't know me. And I'm very fortunate to have Alastair here with us, who's the Warden of Teddy's. Perhaps a little introduction of my own, much less impressive than his. I've been running Opperton for almost a decade now, and we are passionate about all things mentoring. That's really why we exist. We believe that young people, children of all ages, students going through school, they should have opportunities for really strong role modeling, and that they should be able to tackle these big life moments, these school transitions and all sorts of bumps and bruises and scrapes along the way of school and education. We think they should be able to tackle those with pride and with confidence and with communication skills and with all the things that are going to make them successful adults. And I think it's really important that we try and reduce pressure on parents and reduce pressure on children and reduce pressure on schools too, and on the teachers who run these processes. And as part of that wider mission, I think conversations like this are really important because we have the chance to dispel some of the myths and to talk about what really happens in schools and how children are really evaluated and assessed by schools and what matters to schools. So I am so excited to dig into that today. To give a little bit of an introduction for Alastair, and Alastair, you're going to have to forgive me for skipping over some of the greatness in there on the basis of time. Alastair was an Oxford local originally. He was at Dragon School. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a couple of Dragon parents here. He was an Eton King's Scholar, very accomplished one. I think he became a rower as a teenager, followed that through to Merton College, Oxford. I was always told at Oxford that Merton was the college where they always kept the lights on because everyone was working all night. So I don't know if that was true, Alastair, but we know from that reputation
that has the ring of truth to it from my memory.
It must have been a pretty serious educational establishment. So after Merton, classics degree, I think with French, Alastair ended up back at Eton as what must have been very young teacher after a stint in finance. We were always told, Alastair, when I was a boy at Eton, that you'd been off in the city making billions. And I think the reality was probably something different. But for a teenager, it was quite an exciting track record for someone coming back into teaching from the city. You went through house mastering. You went through then to Harrow. You switched to the arch enemy. That must have been an interesting experience. Became director of studies there, all the way through to deputy head. And then it wasn't until September of 2021, which now feels a distant memory ago, but probably still feels quite fresh to you, you became the warden at Teddy's after many years of the previous establishment in place. And I'm going to hopefully give you the chance to speak more about Teddy's as we go through this conversation, but it's an amazing school that has developed in all sorts of interesting ways. IB, A-levels, new buildings, lots of great financing, a mix of day and boarding. It's a school that I know well, and I'm sure you're very proud to run, and we're very privileged that you're joining us. So thank you very much for giving up the time at the end of term. And just to kickstart, I'm going to give you the floor and say this huge area of which we've loosely termed school interviews. All these children, mainly in year 6, some in year 7, probably still in what I call purgatory, heading off to school in the new year to go visit sometimes multiple schools. You've seen this process firsthand across a number of years. I'd love your take on this and some wider trends, and then we'll dig away and ask you some tricky questions. Thanks, Alastair.
Thank you, Henry. Very generous introduction. I mean, it's a very complicated landscape, and those of you who are thinking ahead to it or going through it now will know all of that. So there's the 11 plus or the 13 plus, there's day schools, there's the day school versus boarding school question, the single sex versus co-ed school question. There's the curriculum that schools follow, and that's been a lot in the news recently. Some schools moving away from GCSE, some schools sticking with GCSE, some schools charting a middle course, which is what we're doing here at Teddy's. The range of options and choices is huge, and there are a lot of great schools. And finding the one that's going to be right for your daughter or your son is an incredibly complicated and involved process, even before you get to the process of admission. I'll come back to that in a minute. And I think the key piece of advice on the kind of general landscape I would have to anybody starting on the journey is to take a big step back and to have a very open mind on the kind of school you're going to choose. And the second piece of general advice is to think about the experience of that whole process for your children. So taking children to open mornings regularly on a Saturday morning is hard work for them. and they're events typically designed for, to a huge extent for parents, not for the children who are pretty young when they start looking, maybe even in year 5. So have a think very carefully about the impact of the whole experience on your children. And that plays out really most clearly when you get to the whole process of admission and how those processes run. Different from school to school, different things that schools look for. Some schools with a relatively narrow academic focus, some schools with a determinedly holistic focus, some schools with multiple rounds of admission process, some schools where everything's in year 6 and then the books are shut. Other schools like us where there are multiple iterations of admissions process to allow for late developers, to allow for people to come to the idea of coming to the school later, maybe in year 7 or year 8. And then even beyond that, there's the 14+ admissions process lying further ahead for some children who want to carry on a little bit further in their current schools. And then there's a whole question of sixth form admissions. Lots of pupils deciding to change tack later on in their school careers. So to come back to the kind of 11+, 13+ part of it, I think there's, for me, one of the great regrets in our sector, in the independent school sector, is there isn't more standardization around all of that. So it will be much easier, and this is what happens in some of the big US schools, if there were kind of standardized timelines for admission across a broad range of schools, timelines for visiting, timelines for taking assessments, timelines for schools to make offers, timelines for parents to accept. But that isn't the landscape that we're in, and it's much more fragmented than that. So I think going back to that question of pupil experience, children's experience through it, the more research you can do about the way admissions processes run, in addition to researching the type of school, the more informed your decision making is going to be. And I think the other point I would make is that the best feedback on any school as you think ahead to choosing a school for your children comes from the children who are currently there. And a lot of perception of school, any school, comes from the past. So people who've attended a school previously, they'll have recollections of it, hopefully positive, sometimes maybe less positive, but that will shape their view of the school as it is today, which might have very little relation to what it's actually like to live and learn in a place now. So that kind of word of mouth, what are people saying about the school who are experiencing it right now? Most importantly, as children, as pupils, but also as parents. So, what is the experience like being a parent of a child in a school, of being part of that wider school community? And those kinds of softer points of reference are really important. The other thing, the one when you need to manage carefully how many visits you want to undertake to a school, but the more you visit a place, the more you see. So the more you pick up the soft cues in an environment, the more you hear different things. In the same presentation, if you hear it twice, you meet different people when you visit a school more than once, and that process of familiarization has 2 types of benefit. So one is for the degree of information in your choice as parents and as prospective pupils for your children, but also in terms of your children's readiness for that admissions process that we're coming back to in a minute in the questions Henry's going to be asking. And the more familiar a child is with an environment, the more excited a child is about joining a school, the better the account they will give of themselves, partly by feeling relaxed and at home in the environment and able to be themselves in an assessment context, but also in terms of the level of enthusiasm they'll communicate in talking about their future careers in a school. If they see themselves living and learning there, that will come through in all the answers that they give, and it will help them to focus on the other elements of any admissions process, the kind of testing and assessment process, which is obviously an important part of it, to make sure that it's the right fit for the child. To come back to where I started, though, it's a really complicated landscape, and there's no substitute for talking about it with people like Henry and the others who work with him at Opperton, with people who work in schools. And what you should find is that there is no question, great or small, that an admissions office or a head teacher's office or a head teacher in an independent or a prep school, independent senior school or a prep school, wouldn't be happy to answer. Because nothing should be more important to any of us than making sure that children's choice of school for the future is absolutely right. Last thing to say on all of that is that all the children who are coming up to senior school admission, they're already in schools, and lots of those schools will offer lots of advice on the school to choose, and that's a really important source of information. And the people working in the prep schools and the schools from which children move into secondary senior in the independent sector have a huge range of perspective on the landscape of education at secondary level and on the rightness of schools. Children they've seen go to a place and then thrive there. Children they've seen maybe make a less good decision and not have such a good experience of senior school. Parents who maybe wanted to think again about the choices that they made and change tack later on. And that's a really important source of advice and perspective that you should really take full advantage of. So there are a few general reflections, Henry, on the landscape, but it's complicated to navigate, and I think it's great to have the chance to talk it through. And I'm looking forward to taking questions that people have on the call this morning.
Thank you. Thanks, Alastair. I think that's a great kickoff. And I'm pleased we've started quite broad, because I think we can get quite specific and quite targeted and into the kind of interview next stage. I think it's really nice that most schools are past the assessment piece, as in the kind of, the fractions in the English. We're not going to need to be talking too much about that, which is great. We'll avoid test scores and all of those things. I think we can talk about personality. So before I go into interviews, I really wanted to build on what you just said, which was about the personality of admissions teams and the personality of the process. I think there's a big myth that there's a sort of big wall and no one has a door through it, and actually there's something quite mysterious about admissions teams. But I have visited a lot of admissions teams, including at Teddy's, and they're actually it's one room with a small group of people who work very closely together. They know every student, they know every family through that process, and they're very proud of the work they do, and often have done this work for a number of years through a changing landscape of what that process looks like. I would really encourage parents to be vocal in the right way and to be friendly and personable, and to fill the process with personality of communication, because I think it makes a big difference to the way a school really engages with you. And I think I'd love to hear your reflections on that, Alastair, in terms of perhaps seeing parents get it right, seeing parents get it wrong. I'm not going to ask you to put your foot in it too much, but I'd love to hear any sort of, the best case and perhaps the sort of eccentric howler at the other end. How can we get this process right as a parent? How can we navigate this with the school and come out trumps with the right result?
Great question. So I think the best way is to establish a dialogue with the school. So whether that's through the admissions office, on a first visit, on a kind of registration for an open morning, whether that's on a visit for an open morning, talking to members of staff as they take you around, talking to pupils as they take you around, whether that's coming back for a repeat visit, a private visit to see more of a place and have a more kind of bespoke experience of it, maybe see more of the boarding houses, meet more of the teachers. The more you can build those relationships, as Henry says, with the people who are working in an admissions function, working in a school, the more informed you'll be about the nature of its community, and the more you'll have a sense that they know about and care about your daughter or your son. So how to get it wrong? I think people don't often get it wrong. To be honest, they're making a really important decision. They've got a massive investment, a massive emotional investment, even before you get to the financial investment in the process and in getting it right. I think some people come, if I'm honest, with a preconception of a place, that they know it by its reputation from the past. Maybe when they were at school there, or maybe when they were in a different school, thinking about what that other place was like, the kinds of people they knew who went there from their own prep schools, maybe. And I think those points of historical reference, that's often a point where people go wrong. And schools change quite fast. If I think about the number of things that are new and different here at Teddy since I started in 2021, that's a pretty long list. And the school is really very different to what it was when I was a boy, when I was at the Dragon, and lots of my contemporaries were going off to Teddy's. The school's very different from what it was then. And that's true for every school. And so having a false impression cast by past experience, cast by anecdote from the past is a poor way to approach it. The second element to get right is to be really open in the questions that you ask, and not to let any kind of preconception, any kind of fixed mindset that you might have as a parent about curriculum or around pastoral care or what things should be like in a school get in the way of asking a really open-ended question of people and say, what's important to you? Rather, as Henry started this call with a very open question to get a few points of reference. That's a good way to approach any kind of question. And we, in our open mornings at Teddy's, we make a short presentation on the school, and some they hear people who come here from some pupils, and then we have a panel of people in the senior team here who take questions. And that brings me to another point of getting it right. A lot of people very focused on the registrar and very focused on the head teacher, and registrars and head teachers are important people in the life of the school. But actually, the people who make decisions all day, every day, that affect children's daily experience of school, they're the people who are in the houses in a boarding school, are running the houses in a boarding school. And in any school, they're the people who are in the senior management positions, so the people who are running the curriculum, the people who are running co-curricular life, the people who are running pastoral care. Those people make daily decisions affecting children's lives. So one way in which I think I've seen people get it very right is to engage not just with the registry and not just with the head teacher, but actually to talk to the deputy head academic, to talk to the deputy head pastoral, to talk to the senior deputy who's running school life from day to day, and get a sense of them. What matters to them? How do they make their decisions? If there's a conflict or a clash for a pupil, how do they help the pupil to chart their way through it? If a pupil's struggling academically, what do they do? How do they approach it? What's their philosophy of education? What's their philosophy of caring for children in a school context? And that's I've seen that go hugely well when people have really got under the skin of a place by talking to the daily decision makers in the management structure. So a few points of advice there, things not maybe to avoid, and some suggestions for how you might go around getting under the skin of a place.
Thank you, Alastair. I think there's a nice point there also about you're beginning the relationship of how you of a group of stakeholders that you may engage with on a daily basis for 5 years plus, and so just beginning to reflect that in your early dialogue and in your early relationship building with a school is going to reflect well on you as a family and on your child by sort of by proxy, I suppose, or by ripple effect. And I think sometimes that's overlooked, and we focus in on the narrow detail of who this child is and how quickly they can be the right fit for the right school, when there's a broader social piece almost. I think that's interesting. I'm going to make a very quick admin point, which is that it may well just be my teams, but I'm struggling to see or access my Q&A. And I don't know whether we've had no questions or whether my Q&A is not working or the chat function. But what I'm going to encourage you to do is I emailed everyone on this call, so everyone should have an email in their inbox. henry@oppenandeducation.com. I've got my emails right here. If there's something you'd like to ask and you're struggling to ask it, please fire me through a very informal, quick one-line email, and it will pop up on my screen here. I'll make sure it gets asked. So while I hog the limelight, more questions for me. Interviews specifically, perhaps you could reflect just a little on Teddy's process while keeping it as broad as possible. What are you really excited to see in children who are coming to see you in the next few months? What is it you're looking to pick apart and dig into that you're not going to see from their reference from school or from their test results in the autumn?
Enthusiasm for school life, enthusiasm for studying here. So our interview process is different from lots of schools, actually. So a couple of points on our process. So it comes after a first round of pre-testing, and we try to see as many children as possible for interview, but the numbers are difficult to manage. So we see most people who want to come to the school, and we meet them in person. When we meet them completely blind. So the interviewers, it's a small team of interviewers to make sure that there's enough kind of standardization, if you like, in our process. We have maybe 12, 15 teachers, senior teachers, a lot of experience in a school context, a lot of experience of interviewing children of younger age. And they meet them for about 15 or 20 minutes individually. And every interview starts with a source, with an article from a newspaper or an article from a news magazine, something which is of the moment, because it's much easier to get pupils to respond to something that's in front of them when they're feeling nervous and finding their way in an interview context, talking to someone who's a stranger in a conversation that's obviously important and has been a kind of point in their landscape for a time. And that's the first part. And that's seeing how they respond, how they think, what kinds of ideas they have, what kinds of perspectives they can bring. But also it's designed as a kind of icebreaker to bring them out of themselves a little bit before the interview goes on, to talk a little bit more about academic life, talk about the kinds of things that pupils are doing children are doing in school. What are they enjoying in their subjects? What are they not enjoying? What they see as their strengths, their weaknesses, how reflective are they as people? And then the interview broadens out from there to other interests that pupils have, and then a more general part about themselves as people. And that last part's the most important, because we're trying to get a sense of the individual. So we get all the information in about pupils from their current schools, lots of really detailed, thoughtful references provided by head teachers and other people working as form tutors and as middle leaders in their prep schools and their current schools. And that's a hugely important part of the eventual decision-making process. So we have all of that, and then we have all the kind of quantitative information, the facts and the figures from testing. So the interview is really about the person, and that's why when we meet the children who come here, we don't meet them with anything more than just their name as a point of information about them, so we can take them exactly as we find them as a person. And then eventually, further down the track, we put all the information together, all of those kind of all those facts and those figures and the references and the other comments from teachers at current schools, together with the feedback from the interviewers, and that's how we make our eventual decision. So to go back to that interview experience, what's the best way to approach it? Well, the answer is just to be yourself. And that point I made earlier about familiarity and frequency of visits, and making sure that the child can see themselves studying in the school really helps. It takes a little bit of the unfamiliarity out of it, a little bit of the kind of risk that it's an anxious experience, and makes it a bit more of a comfortable experience. So that's one observation. And then not to try to prepare too much. A prepared answer is always really obvious, and a natural answer is always clearly a natural answer. And it's our job as interviewers to bring the child out of themselves, to make sure that we're getting a real sense of them and for who they are, rather than who they've been prepared to be in the interview context. But the less preparation that you do in those terms, the better. Beyond just talking about, what are you enjoying at school, and what are you enjoying in those activities that you're taking part in, and what might you want to do if you came to the school, and what things haven't you had a chance to do you might have a go at in the future. Those kinds of conversations that you can have with your children in the car or on the way home, on the way to and from school, just to get them thinking about some of the kinds of things that are going to be asked in an interview context. But really, when, especially in a boarding school where the children are living here all the time, and we're mainly a boarding school, 85% of our pupils here at Teddy's are boarders. It's the person that counts, and it's not their studies that are dominant. It's not their activities that are dominant. It's actually all aspects of their lives. They're part of our community for 7 months of the year when the school is open and everyone's here. It's for who they are that they should be admitted, not for things that they've learned in the past or skills that they've developed, but actually just for who they are as a person to have in a community. That's the single biggest determinant of success. So the more enthusiastic they are, and the more they see themselves living and learning in a place, the better the account they're going to give, and the more likely they are to be successful. So those are some observations about our process, and some of the points of advice I'd have for people who are thinking ahead to it.
Thank you. That's very detailed. And I didn't know that about the blind interview process. I think that's a really interesting point of difference, because I know it's not the case across all schools. I have no idea. I wonder whether if we were to survey everyone right now, whether that would be deemed something that would worry them or would be fantastic, or probably a mix of the two, depending on the child's profile. And I'd be interested as to how, when you bring those bits of information together, the stellar academic output mixed with a slightly shy child, or a really confident, wonderful contributor who actually is a bit of a worry academically, there must be a little bit of a conflict there. I suppose, how do you begin to tie those things together? And is there any advice that can sort of assure parents as to how that mixed bag of skills is sort of catered for in any decision-making process, whether it's at Teddy's or other similar schools?
Yeah, so I think well, the way I'll tell you how we do it, I think every school approaches these kinds of things a little bit differently. So we changed to blind interviewing in autumn 22. And we did that because we were lucky, and we had lots more people wanting to come to the school than we'd had previously. And I think there's a real risk if you don't interview blind, that there is a kind of a rush to judgment, a rush to prejudgment on a pupil. If they've got a very high CAT score or a very high ISEB common pretest score, then you're kind of predisposed to want to like them, to try to admit them into the school, and that's not an unreasonable instinctive reaction for an interviewer. And the same is true for the schools for the schools they currently go to. So if it's an important feeder school, there's a kind of risk. There's a risk of prejudice in the sense of prejudgment, and we want to guard against that completely, which is why we changed it. And we're really committed here, as I think all schools should be, to a holistic approach to admissions, rather than just creaming off a narrow stratum at the top of a list of test scores, to preserving the breadth on entry. And I think that's, for me, in educational terms, the point of it. So we're getting children ready for the world beyond school, and in the world beyond school, there's a really wide range of people. Not everybody's really clever. You're going to meet and interact with and be successful and lead a fulfilling and fulfilled life if you've got a high level of emotional intelligence that comes from growing up in a diverse community. And that for us is really important philosophically, which is why we moved to the blind admissions. So to answer your question directly, Henry, on how we do it. So again, this I think is different from lots of schools. So we have a committee of people who make the decisions. I think all the best decisions in any context are made by groups of people working together, so that there's no kind of dominant voice or single voice that makes the judgments and all the decisions on candidates for admission. I think it's true not just for admissions but for everything in school. A kind of plurality of perspective is really important. So in our admissions committee, we have the sub-warden academic, a man called David Flower, who oversees all the teaching and learning in the school. Claire Hamilton, who's the sub-warden, she's the senior deputy. She oversees everything pastoral and co-curricular. I'm involved in this, obviously, as the warden, the head teacher, and Nikki Jones, the registrar, she's involved too, from her knowledge of the children through all the way through the process. And the way that we do it is we tabulate all the data, all the information that we've got. That's a kind of a summary of the reference from the current school. It's all of the testing data, not just the snapshot testing data from the admissions round, but all the historic data as well. So CAT scores that children have done previously, the kinds of trends that were there in their academic work before they took our assessments. Then the feedback from the interview, obviously, that's really important. So and that's really detailed feedback. And we have with us in the room, we have all of the paperwork, and we look through if we've got questions or a difficult decision to make about whom to take forward. Then we'll actually go to the interview notes and read them in detail in the meeting. And we dedicate hours to this process. So we're around the table for 4, 5, or 6 hours at a time, looking through all that information, talking about each of the candidates. And some decisions on admission are relatively easy, and some decisions on admission are really difficult. And children who have amazing scores in tests and are leading the co-curricular lives of their current schools and are super impressive at interview, very confident people, they're quite easy to make decisions on. And pupils for whom it might not be the right school in curricular terms, that's relatively clear too. But there aren't many in those two categories. There's a huge number of children who need to be discussed as people, and we take all of those inputs together, and then we try to put together a year group and intake, which is going to be balanced in all the right ways, and it's going to be broad. And it's going to be the right environment in which those children can grow up, so that all the children can have enough points of connection, if you like, with the others in their boarding houses, especially. And that's especially true in a boarding house. If you think about a year group of 150, it's quite hard to get a handle on it. If you think about a year group of 10 or 12 in a boarding house, it's very easy to see that as a group and say, well, within that group, and this is something I learned when I was running a boarding house at Eton, you need to have enough points of connection for every pupil in that year group in order for every one of them to have a really positive experience of school. If you've got 9 people who are all the same and one who's an outlier, it's going to be very hard for that one to make their way, especially in the early part of their school career, where confidence can be affected, and actually the direction of travel for their time at school can be set in the wrong way. So actually making sure there's that breadth within a small year group, and that comes much later for us, comes much later for boarding schools where they're putting together their house list. But the point of principle stands right at the beginning of the decision making on admission, to make sure that the whole of the intake has got that likelihood of being broad and balanced in the right ways, with that range of connections for everybody.
Right, thank you. That's very detailed. I've had a few things fire through on here, so I'm going to approach them in no particular order. I think there's a really interesting point from a parent going through the London process, and it comes across as actually I think it's a fair grumble, which is, the London process is sometimes at such scale. I know there'll be parents listening to this going through that London process, the day school market particularly, such scale. How can you possibly hope to engage with the senior management team from a school when you're barely allowed through the gates for some of these processes? I suppose there's less of a sort of handheld experience through that. I don't know whether to put this to you, Alastair, or whether I can sort of answer this, but I think there are always ways to engage with the school admissions team thoughtfully, no matter its size, and to showcase and to reflect the right experiences of your child and the right questions that you have, that I think will portray you as the parent that you are. I don't know if you'd add anything just very briefly to that, Alastair, in terms of maybe how to inject personality into a London day process with all its differences.
So I've not been to a London day school open morning, but I'd be very surprised if the senior leaders weren't involved, and I'd be very surprised if they didn't offer a cup of coffee at some point in the process, and just make a beeline for the person you heard from on the stage talking about academic life, and seek them out. And if that doesn't work, then write to them. And if they don't want to engage, I would view that pretty negatively. So it's important. It's important to us as educators to be open to parents, to have a positive conversation about senior school admission, about education in general. And if people don't want to engage in that, then maybe that's not the right school. It should be very easy to it's easier than you think to get in touch. So I think it's quite easy to attend these things, and there are lots of people there, and it's a competitive process, and you don't feel like you're on the front foot. But it's your child's education. So my advice would be not to be shy, and just to go up to them and say, I'd like to ask you about this. And And then if there isn't time or space for that in the visit, then say to the admissions team, I've got a couple of questions. Would you mind putting me in touch, or would you mind putting them to on my behalf, the people who are making those decisions? And if they don't want to engage, then I think that tells you quite a lot about the school.
I think that's good mentorship in its own right. If you don't ask, you don't get. I think that's good. I think that encourages a sort of forward approach while being measured. I mean, Britain's a funny place, isn't it? But I think approaching those relationships in the right way, we can get it. We can make something of it. I think there's a really good question here, which I was expecting the minute Alastair mentioned don't prepare for interviews. How does all this butt up with Oppidum offering mentoring that supports preparation for interview? And I'm going to take that first. And Alastair, don't feel any obligation to say anything by reply to it. But and who knows, maybe this is an area we disagree. I am so passionate about the idea that preparation for this process can be done correctly and can be done with the right measured approach and the right information. So there is a huge difference between telling your child to say something specific and preparing them for a process that you think is going to be a certain way, and sending them in as a little automaton who doesn't believe or understand anything that they've been told to talk about, versus a nurturing mentoring process that workshops skills that can support a positive experience at interview. And I think those two things are night and day. I totally understand skepticism from parents of which side of the fence to fall on there. I think we're dragging ourselves away from, academic handcuffed basement tuition to a space here where children can benefit from role modeling, and that role modeling can support them really productively to give their best in what is a very difficult, forced environment. I mean, in a wonderful, it would be wonderful if every school could spend a full day with children and really get to know them, and it would just all be, exactly how they are. But everyone wants to do their best. Everyone wants marginal gains. And I think that as a parent, whether or not you choose to employ a mentor from Oppidum or any other help, or a cousin or a brother or a sister or whoever it might be, there is a supportive playbook that you can follow at home as a parent. So just to give two ideas I have on that. One, just so there's some tangible takeaways for this, so we can't get accused of being too theoretical. One is Thunks. If you've not heard of it, I talk about it a lot, but please do go and explore. Little book on Amazon, Little Book of Thunks, spelt with a U. And it's questions that have no answer. Anything that stirs your child's imagination towards explaining themselves about things that they don't have a right or wrong answer to, and that they may not have thought about before, is really positive. At one end of the spectrum, you can ask them about, is eating a packet of crisps in the supermarket stealing if you pay for it when you leave? At the other end of the spectrum, would you rather have your hands in the air for the rest of your life or have cheesy Wotsits for fingers? You can be really trite about it. It doesn't really matter as long as these children are having an experience of talking about those things. The second thing I think is really important to this is your outlook on what the process looks like. You're going to have multiple schools. Think of it as a horizontal hierarchy. And by horizontal hierarchy, I mean, have your schools laid out for their differences, but not as an ABC, but as here is a spectrum of choice. Here are differences that you, as my child, can reflect on and make decisions for yourself around what fits you best. And in that sense, nothing will be a success or a failure. And the process becomes far more driven by the child, and they become autonomous and independent in what they're doing. And by doing so, the ripple effect is they turn up to go and see Alastair and his team at Teddy's or wherever it is, and they feel so confident that they have a right to be there, and that they have a brain that can be used, and they can ask their own questions and feel part of the process in a meaningful way. And I think that totally changes the dynamic for someone who's 10 turning 11, which, let's face it, is a brutal time to meet them and to put them under a situation like this. Alastair, I don't know if you want to reflect on any of that anymore, but
yeah, no, I think it's great. So I remember when I was interviewing for places in my boarding house, a boy came along who was very nice boy, and I asked him, what do you enjoy doing in the holidays? And he told me about that he enjoyed nothing more than the charitable work that he was undertaking in Africa. And that is partially true, but that's not the whole truth. And that's an example of poor preparation. So he had been given poor, somewhat to say. And that, if he'd mentioned that in the context of a wide range of other things, like, playing football with his friends and going camping and, having fun in the afternoons, then that would have been fine. But that was his answer, and he labored on it. So he had clearly been told to say that. So he had been prepared in a way that was false. And that is a good example of what not to do. Children, everybody's different. So some parents and some children have the scope to have those kinds of conversations that Henry describes. They're really, really easily, really naturally, really frequently. Other parents are busy. If you're both working, and that's the case for lots of parents looking at independent schools. Now it's quite hard to find the time and the space to have those kinds of conversations on the thunk theme or anything else in an interview preparation context. And that's where asking friends to help, asking Henry and his friends to help is not an unreasonable thing to do. But that's not a narrow type of forced preparation. That's just another avenue for discussion. And the other thing to say is that it isn't all about the admissions process. So I think the idea that you would, I have a coach, and I'm 47, and I meet with him once every half term or so online, and from time to time he comes in to meet me here. A man called Stephen Spur, who was the headmaster of Westminster and Clifton before that, and he was my tutor when I was a boy, as a classicist at Eton, and I've kept in touch, and he's got huge perspective, and he coaches me through my career, and there's nothing wrong with having a coach. And that's not the same as a narrowly focused preparation for interview. That's bringing the best out of someone through conversation, through reflection, through kind of guided dialogue with someone who's got more experience of life and of work than I do, and than the children who are working with Henry do as they make their way through their early childhood. So those are some observations there. So there is clearly a place for it, and lots of people on the call will be working with Henry and his team, and I've met Henry and Henry's team, and they're great people, and that does have a value, but it's not in the kind of this is what you should say if you're asked about kind of context.
Thank you, Alastair. I think that's conclusive. I like that. You have a coach. We're all allowed to have a coach. There's a really interesting point here, which I get quite often about children who are more naturally reserved, have a lot to offer, but may not be the best at selling themselves. My initial knee jerk to that would be, remember that there's a reference, and that reference is detailed, and it's a really important piece of the puzzle. And schools do very well with references and have meaningful relationships with senior schools to explain your child and to make sure that those things come across. They will have their test scores in terms of all they have to offer at that. And all I would encourage is contribution. Children explaining that they are naturally nervous, or that they naturally, there's nothing better than just owning that with some kind of contribution and not being worried about the perspective of the other person about how that may feel. So celebrating difference, celebrating more naturally shy children. I don't know if you'd add anything to that on the shy point, Alastair.
Yeah, so I think it's children. Lots of children are shy. And it's an event in the diary to come to a senior school for an admissions process. So a natural reticence is not to be something to surprise. It's our job as interviewers to help the children to be themselves. And that's why we start our interviews with an article, something of general interest. So that they're not kind of thinking, gosh, what are they going to ask me now? They know what they're going to be asked. They're going to be given something to read, and they're going to be asked to say, well, what's this about? And that's for us a really easy way of getting children to relax into it a little bit and start to talk. The other thing to say is that we know, obviously, as Henry says, the head teachers of the prep schools really well. And if we find a mismatch between what they've written in their reference and what we've perceived as interview, then we'll just pick up the phone and ask them and say, actually, this boy or girl who's presented as a candidate, they were a bit more reticent in interview than we were expecting. What do you think? And they might provide a different perspective. There might be something else going on in their lives in that week or in that time, or something outside school. It could be anything. And that's the kind of additional context that we will hopefully know already from the prep school, but definitely seek to find out if there's a kind of mismatch. But the big thing is that, I think a skillful interviewer can help every child to give a good account of themselves, to be themselves. And the second thing to say is that you can come back and do it again. So the benefit of our approach, where we run a process in year 6 and in year 7 and in year 8 for admission in year 9, is that if it doesn't go quite so well, and that does sometimes happen, you can come back and have a go again. And I think that's a good way of approaching admissions. It's different from lots of schools which seek to fill all their places in year 6, and that's obviously different from the 11 plus as well, where the ship is sailing in the start of year 7. But I think that's a benefit of a 13 plus admission, because you have that option to come back again with another year of maturity, another year of perspective, with the experience of the first interview, the first experience of the process, to inform and improve the second. I think that often happens for us, that pupils who don't maybe give a good account of themselves first time around, they come back again with a year more maturity, and they're very different in presentation second time. And that, I think, is a good way to approach it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alastair. One quick reminder, which I've had two people ask about the book. The book is The Little Book of Thunks. It's spelt like think, but with a U. And I think there's a couple of volumes. They're about £4 on Amazon. It's great fun for the car or any environment really, and I found it very useful certainly. So Little Book of Thunks to answer that one. Thunk with a U. I think we've got time for one more question, if that's all right, Alastair. And I think it's an interesting point. We often have approaches from parents who are either coming from state schools or are coming from international schools. And I think they have a natural and probably fairly fair concern that they won't be as well represented at reference. The child may do wonderfully on the test and the interview, but the reference may be a little lacking in either detail or experience. No, not through anyone's fault, but just by nature of the setting that they come from. Perhaps you could assuage fears for either of those environments in terms of how references are managed and looked at, and sort of what you look to glean from them. I'm sure you get shoddy references on every side of the school spectrum, whether it's a high fee paying school or a state school or an international school, depending on who's writing it. So perhaps how you measure and assess those would be useful context to finish.
I don't think any of them is shoddy. I think they're they're degrees of helpfulness in the things that people write, but they're all all well done. So a couple of things. One is that we're conscious of that as a school, and I think lots of other schools do the same thing. And we run open mornings pretty much every Saturday of term time for 200 people or so at a time. We also, in the summer, run an open evening for fee support pupils, for pupils who would be looking to come to the school with means-tested support. If this kind of environment is very unfamiliar, that really helps, I think. And even the language that schools use, shall and fourth form and those kinds of terms can be difficult and potentially off-putting. So more generally, though, how do we deal with asymmetry and references? Well, the first thing to say is the reference is only one part of it. The most important part of it is the child in front of us, the child whom we've met. And the references are kind of counterpoint to that, and it provides more perspective and it provides more information that we can get out of an interview. But ultimately, our experience of meeting the child is hugely important. All references include historical information about children's attainment, children's testing level in Cat 4 tests and the like at school. And that information comes through automatically in any reference, whatever school it comes from. And then the other thing we're conscious of is range of opportunity. So some pupils have had a chance to do literally everything under the sun at really amazing prep schools where they're at school, and some children haven't. And so you can't put too much weight on that range of opportunity, which isn't available to everybody. Which is why it's so important to have everything in the mix and not to be reliant on the prep reference and not to be reliant on the test score and not to be reliant on the interview, but to have all of those different inputs all together, and then for everything to be discussed. The other thing to say is that the children, the people working in anybody working with children wants to do the best by them. And actually, the depth of information that we get from everybody writing about children is great. So there are degrees of greatness, but we're not unsighted on anybody coming into the admissions process, and that's an important point of reassurance. I hope I've provided it.
Thank you. That is very reassuring. And I think important to note those different pieces of the jigsaw and how well thought through they are. I think I come away from this conversation with real faith in the professionalism of admissions teams and schools to get this process right. I think it's really important that parents have that trust and feel secure in the knowledge that their children are going to get a really good look over. So I think we're going to come to an end. But before we do, I want to say my thanks firstly, and to give Alastair a little chance just to tell us any next steps for Teddy's. I mean, this is your third year. The school, as you mentioned, has changed and is continuing to change. Any big horizon scanning moments for you that would be useful to note for parents who are heading through this process?
Great question. So in admissions terms, we're going to do more of the things that we've done recently. So we've changed our admissions process and our approach to it, and we've re-articulated, if you like, what we're about as a school. So we've talked a lot about scholarship and the life of the mind and making more of our location in Oxford. And we've set up lots of things in the last couple of years. And now as we go we're now in year 3 since I started, and we're looking to kind of bring those things to kind of fruition, if you like. So academic traffic from the university into the school, and traffic from school into the university, into the faculties and the libraries and the galleries and the like. That's all now set up and running across all departments. One of the things that's going to be different and new in the coming year is to have much more teaching done by postgraduate students from the university in the school. That's something for this current year, for my third year in post, and looking for 24 and 25. So that's going to be one postgraduate student working in every teaching department at Teddy's within the next 12 months or so. That's a really exciting point of development for us. Other things that we're working on really hard at the moment. So that scholarship service is another huge point of focus for us. So already we've got a new program which puts all of our lower sixth working in local primary schools and charities and other organizations locally in Oxford as part of their timetable, every last one of them for 90 minutes every week. And the big project now for the rest of this year, and then especially in 24-25, is to make that program universal and for it to run all the way from the shell to the upper sixth, so that service is a meaningful part of every child's experience of the school all the way through their time here. And then the last element that we're of our forward thinking, if you like, is around excellence in the facilities and the structures that we provide. And we've got some very exciting plans for the development of the estate, especially around facilities for sport and for the community here in Oxford. And that's the third strand for the next few years. Beyond that, in admissions terms, we're going to carry on doing what we've always done, which is educating pupils in a broad and balanced way, in a diverse community, in a way that's preparing them well for life, far beyond their academic careers into through university, maybe not even through university, but through a different track into the world of work. And the careers piece is a hugely important point of focus for us in 2024, and we'll be talking much more about that at our open mornings, to which I hope many of you will come.
Wonderful. Thank you. You are the perfect guest because you're so eloquent and speedy in the way you speak. You don't grandstand at all. And we've got through a huge amount of material in 46 minutes. So I'm really, really grateful for the time you've shared at the end of a long term. It's much appreciated, I know, by anyone on this call and those who will watch the recording of this and benefit from it probably for months, if not years to come. So thank you for sharing that time. Thank you to everyone for good questions and insightful comments. And I hope we've made clear what the Oppidum piece of the puzzle is. I won't bang that drum too much. And very, very grateful to everyone for tuning in. To Alastair, have a very happy Christmas. And thank you for all the time and engagement so far. Thanks, Alastair.
Happy Christmas to all of you. Nice to see you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.